I'm going to begin today by talking about what education is, and then talk about what we mean by art. It's a little different than what you heard yesterday, partly because we'll be talking about it from the perspective of education rather than the perspective of the artist. And then we'll tie into that some discussion of the importance of art in a good education. And I might even leave a few minutes for a question or two. There are a couple of different ways we could talk about what education is. We could talk about the curriculum, what things are studied, what the content of the education is, the books used, topics covered. We could also talk about pedagogical methods, the ways we teach. Should we teach by direct instruction or Socratic dialogue, or maybe small group discussions and active learning? We could talk about it in terms of sort of the shape of the school. Is it at home or is it in a school building? Who does the teaching? Is it parents or paid teachers? How big are the classes? How long do the students study? We could talk about education in that way. But I'm not going to talk about those things today. Today, I'm going to focus on the most important aspect of defining education, and the one from which all the others must flow. What is the purpose of education? What is its end, its telos? For some kinds of education, that purpose seems rather obvious. If I send my son to get an education in carpentry, well, I expect him to become a good carpenter. If I send someone to get an education in programming, one would expect a proficient programmer on the other side. These would be the primary goals of those things, regardless of whatever else came alongside them. Once we get out of the strictly vocational kinds of education, though, the answer becomes a little harder to define. If you asked the local public schools what they thought the purpose of education was, if they could give you an answer, they would probably say something along the lines of finding remunerative employment, getting a good paying job, or getting accepted to a good college. That would be their end. With all these kinds of education, I'm not talking about how successful people are at executing those things. The success of the execution probably has more to do with the other ways of defining that I talked about a minute ago, rather than the actual end itself. But what are they actually aiming at, whether or not they achieve it? If you ask our parochial schools what the purpose of education is, they have a much higher aim. They will tell you that their goal is to help parents raise their children in the faith, to have them grow up to love Jesus, and ultimately to go to heaven. If you ask them further questions like, how do social studies or algebra help to achieve that goal, they turn out not to be quite sure. The answers that I've gotten is they say they teach those things because the state standards say they should teach them. Not sure what purpose that is. At best, it's because the parents want them. So what is the purpose of a classical Lutheran education then? Is it like the technical education that we want to produce skilled classicists? Or like the parochial education that, right, we want to bring up children in the faith? We have this other stuff that we do. We just have a different set of standards. It's not the state standards, it's sort of the medieval state standards. Fortunately for us, and especially for you, I do not have to guess, and neither do I have to make up an answer. The history of classical education is the history of trying to answer this question. And everyone from Plato to Augustine to Melanchthon to Rousseau says, in broad strokes, the same thing. which is that the purpose of education is the formation of the student as a human being. It is not for employment or for patriotism or for state standards that we educate children, but to form them to be truly human, to be what they were created to be. Obviously, when Christians like Augustine say these things, they mean something slightly different than Rousseau or Plato. They, at the very least, fill in a lack that their pagan counterparts have in their thinking. The pagans say that we are trying to form a man to be the best that he is naturally, to look at what man is and what we can draw from that and what he seems to be aiming at, and then to help him to become that. Original sin puts a damper on this particular way of thinking. There is a way it can be understood rightly, but it requires some correction from the Bible. So Augustine famously says that education is about ordering our loves, the ordo amoris, teaching the student what he ought to love, and training him to love it. This, of course, encompasses the desire to pass on the doctrines of the faith, but is also more expansive than that. We learn from the scriptures that love is not, as our world would have it, something exclusively emotional. But we love not only with our heart, but also with our soul and our mind and our strength, which is to say that the whole human self is tied up with loving. And so, when we combine this with Augustine's Ordo Amoris, we see that education has to be about forming the whole human person to be directed in the way he ought to go. My second favorite pithy definition of education comes from Johann Sturm, a woefully underknown Lutheran educator. Got some theological things a bit wrong, but was pretty good at education. And he said that the goal of education is a wise and eloquent piety. Now, that might not seem at first glance to be quite the same, and it probably isn't, different emphasis. But if you consider what is necessary to inculcate wisdom, to develop eloquence, and to nurture piety, it turns out to be very similar. The scriptures, of course, do not speak of classical education any more than Augustine does, and this vocabulary is foreign to them for somewhat obvious reasons. But it does talk about the man of God growing in wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, that he is prepared to do every good work, that we should hold on to instruction because it is our life. Obviously, in all of these instances, the emphasis is on teaching the scriptures, teaching the word of God, but I do not think is limited to that. You also notice that in these descriptions, the emphasis is on what the man of God would become. Not what job he would get, how much he might get paid, what standards he might meet, but what he would be. It is the formation of him as a man. In fact, Solomon says the opposite of this sort of emphasis on getting a good job, right? How much better to get wisdom than gold. To get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. So this, then, is the end, the purpose of education, to order our loves so that we would love what we ought to love and hate what we ought to hate, to develop a wise and eloquent piety, and to grow in knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. No small task, that. And a man educated in this way will truly be prepared for the good works put in front of him, to serve his neighbor, to provide for his family, to build up the church, to be a just magistrate, and the like. But at this point, you might object. That definition is pretty broad. not terribly practical. Doesn't tell me much about what would be going on in a school that claimed to be a classical school. Besides, I've heard something about this classical education, and I'm pretty sure it has something to do with teaching Latin and logic. These are valid objections. So, I should probably address them. To the first, the definition was not meant to be practical. It is meant to set forth a North Star, a guide, a guiding principle by which we can judge the other decisions that we would make along the way. The practical questions are more easily answered by those other definitions of education. What is the curriculum? What is the pedagogy? What does the school look like? But if we don't know what the school is for, we won't know how to answer those other questions. And we will be blown about by whatever winds of educational doctrine happen to be current. So for classical education, the answer to those other questions is driven by two things: the purpose of education, which we just outlined, and also the way that other wise and pious men have answered those questions in history. Classical educators have a respect for tradition that says that if 100 generations of men across different cultures and times have included a thing in a curriculum, you shouldn't take it out. If you're not teaching the Iliad in your school, you're doing it wrong. This respect for our forebears gives us half of the answer to the second objection. The Latin and logic, aren't those what classical education is about? Or maybe great books, right? We teach those in part because they're good in themselves. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But also in part because they have been taught for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years in the schools of Christians who were trying to teach their children well. But those men didn't pick randomly. They didn't decide to keep the books that they kept, to teach the things that they taught simply because they were there. Like I said, these men thought about what they taught and why. And so we have in the keeping of them the judgment, the sound judgment of generations. I don't really have time today to go over how each piece of the curriculum or each method of pedagogy or how the school day functions all fits into this and this purpose of education, especially since I'm supposed to be talking about art eventually. So a single example from the curriculum will have to suffice, but many of the others could be answered in similar ways. There's an obvious choice for that example, right? The most conspicuous feature of classical education, especially in our time, which is Latin. Why do we teach Latin? How does it fit into this end, this purpose of education? You can go online and ask this question, whatever AI chatbot you happen to prefer, and you might get a whole bunch of different answers. But I think there are two that are really central and tie into the actual purpose of education and are the primary effects of learning Latin specifically, not of just learning a foreign language, which has a whole host of benefits for the learner. First is that we learn Latin because translation is both necessary and impossible. It's true that the sense of a passage may be given in translation, and that a word or phrase might be translated completely by more or fewer words or phrases in another language. But every pastor who has ever interrupted himself during a Bible class to give a lengthy explanation of a single Greek word And even better, to point out what the author of the book is doing with that word throughout the passage and tying it into other words that are related, knows that there's no way to translate that into another language, English or otherwise. And so the translation can never be quite as good as the original. This is part of why we teach the languages in our seminaries. And so with Latin particularly, we have a language in which most of what was worthwhile that was written down in Europe for 1,000 years is written in one language. Well, if those things are worthwhile, it might be worthwhile to be able to access them directly instead of through a translator. At the very least, we ought to teach our students to be familiar with the language so that they can judge between translations. But ideally, we would teach them to be able to access them in the original. Latin was never meant in classical education, by the way, to be the only language taught. Right? We teach all the classical languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Right? And the same arguments, of course, easily apply to Greek and Hebrew, even more so, perhaps, because the Word of God is written in those things. The second has to do with the first, which is that each language has its own way of thinking, or maybe is a way of thinking, a way of expressing and associating ideas that is particular to that language. These ways of expressing are ways of understanding the world. I recently learned that Spanish, modern Spanish, uses the passive voice more than the active voice. These Spanish speakers in the room, is that true? This is what I've heard, right? That it uses the passive voice significantly more than we do, and maybe even more than the active voice. This says something about the way that they see the world and their ability to be active in it. It's not, of course, determinative, but it is a way of thinking. We could give 100 examples of this, right? The canonical example being the number of words that Eskimos have for snow, right? It's a bunch. The Romans have 33 words for killing. It's not surprising. Greek has 4 words for love. It's a little weird to the English person, right? So those things, though, tell you something about what those cultures think and the way that they think. And altogether, once you have learned the language, it forms a whole way of thinking, what one author calls a mind, that there might be a Latin mind. Pastor Peterson is always accusing us of being Greek because we want precision and we want accuracy. And the Hebrew mind does not care for such things in the same way that we do. I'm not sure that we are Greek. I think we're more Germanic and Anglo in our ways of thinking. And this is indicated by the other thing. It's not just vocabulary that indicates a way of thinking, but also syntax. We like our sentences short, to the point, with the subject and verb up front, easy to understand. Latin will not give you such a thing, does not like to write its sentences that way, likes to stick the main verb at the end of the clause, or perhaps the sentence after several intermediary clauses, making you hold the whole idea in your head as sort of a number of different ideas that could be true until you get to that last word that seals it into one. We hate that. But it is a different way of thinking, and maybe there is some good in it. And that way of thinking is really only going to get into your head, into your own possible ways of thinking by learning that language. So those are the reasons we teach Latin, because those two things are ways of forming the student, of giving him another way of thinking about the world that might be better in certain times and places, of giving him access to some of the best things that have been thought and said in a direct way that can form his heart and shape his loves. And so a similar defense, like I said, could be made of the other parts of the curriculum. don't have time to go into why algebra would also fit under this sort of defense, but it does. I've made that defense. I assure you it exists. Along with the kinds of pedagogy we use and the way that our school day is shaped and the way our classrooms are and everything down the line. But what about art? That's what I'm supposed to be talking about. How does art fit into this definition? Well, I'm going to talk about art slightly differently than the presenters yesterday. First, we have to make a distinction here about what we mean by art. Because of the nature of this conference and the other presenters, we're going to stick to the visual arts, right? Painting, drawing, sculpture, that sort of thing. This same explanation can be made somewhat easily with a few modifications of things like music or theater. I think you'd have to do some more significant modification to get to something like the liberal arts, but that's a whole different can of worms. So we're going to just stick to the visual arts today. And yesterday you heard a sort of discussion of the visual arts from the perspective of an artist, what the artist is doing with the visual arts, how to maybe see that in some of his paintings. I want to talk about it a little bit more pedagogically, a little bit more with regards to education. And to do that, I want to break it into three parts. When we talk about art, right, if you talk about an art class in school, what we're talking about primarily there is the teaching of the skills, the methodology, how to produce a piece of art. So that's the first part. The second part is the actual thing produced, right? The work of art, the artifact, right? And that's different. And then the third thing is how to look at that art, how to view it, how to observe it and understand it. And I think all three of them matter and have different reasons for doing them. I want to start with the middle one, though, the artifact itself. And one thing that I noted yesterday with Ed Riojas's presentation, he made a point for me very well that art is not made for the sake of the art. There are some things that we do for the sake of the doing. But with the altarpiece that he made, and then he couldn't sell it, right? And then it ended up in his attic. And he eventually gave it away. Why did he do that? Because he knew that it wasn't made just for the sake of making it. There was a purpose to it that could not be fulfilled while it was sitting in his attic. I also like the Keats quote, Ode to a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. Maybe I flip that around. I'm not exactly sure I agree. It's worth pondering. But it's on to something about art. That the purpose of this artifact is, I think, either to show us the truth beautifully or to show us beauty truthfully. They have different purposes, I think, and maybe they blend together in some places. But sometimes we're trying to tell a truth. We're trying to use symbols, right, to tell a story, to make an understanding come across. I think a lot of Ed Riojas's art is particularly like this. Right? He's trying to tell you something, like an orator would, but is using paint to do it. And he's doing it beautifully. We don't have time to talk about what beauty is either. But one thing to say about it is that it is objective. And the Pietà, for instance, is also trying to tell us something, right? It's not just there to be beautiful. It's telling us something about the love of Christ, the love of a mother for her son, the sorrow of death, right? And it is objectively beautiful. If you don't think it is, you're wrong. But there's also those things that are primarily there to show beauty and to show it truly. And I think actually Rehav's painting of the house is such a great example of this. The little house, remember, that was in the picture behind his daughter in the stroller. He saw this little house on the street. And he was sort of caught up with, what if I saw this horse in the window? And then had this vision of the house, and he painted it. I wasn't struck so much by the horse, but as the fact that he took this drab little house, sort of interesting in its architecture, but not really much to say for itself. Maybe the paint's peeling a little bit. And what he painted was not that. He painted a home. He painted the beauty that is caught up with a house that has people in it, with a home. And he made it so that you could see it. Right? You couldn't see it, maybe, looking at the house. He said, the artist is to be an observer. This is what he is to observe, the beauty in the world and the truth in the world, and to bring it out so that you can also see it. This is not done by a logical demonstration, not like an argument like I'm making here, but it's done by showing. Right? This impulse to behold, look, see. And that showing that the artifact does on its own, apart from the artist, it causes us to love those things. We can see the truth of the Pietà and we can love it. In fact, it sort of compels us to love it. By drawing the beauty out of the world and putting it forth to you truthfully, it causes you to see that beauty and to love it. So I think in this way, the artifacts themselves are a part of our education. What we put on the walls of the school, what the students look at, what they study. Those things are part of forming their loves. Talk a little bit more about that later. I want to move on to talking about the first of the three. How do we make such a thing? And this is where I feel the most out of my depth. I'm not an artist. I do not know how to make art. But I feel like I have to talk about it anyway. So I'm going to. I can't give you very much detail about it, but there's a couple of things that I think I can say with some confidence. The first is that goes back to this artist as the observer. In order to produce a work of art, to bring that beauty or truth out, you have to be able to see it. And so it requires cultivating a careful observation of a certain kind, a habit of attention. A habit of paying attention particularly to what is true and what is good. Now, and what is beautiful, of course. Now, those things don't always mean happy. I do want to clear that up, right? There can be, obviously, beautiful sorrow. There can be some truth, like the isolation of a mass transport system that might be portrayed beautifully, but might make you really uncomfortable, as it ought to, because it's inhuman. But the habit of attention and observation that comes from that learning how to make art, that habit, of course, applies to other things. This forms a habit that would transcend simply art. It might just teach you to notice more about what God has given you, about the beauty in the world around you, about your family and your spouse and your children, right? To see the good things in them. Might help you to read the Bible better, to pay better attention to what is actually there. Again, the Riojas painting of St. Michael fighting Satan over the body of Moses. This is because he paid attention to the words. There's one little verse, it's weird, but it struck him because he has this habit of paying attention to things, particularly visual things. But this habit of attention helps us even to read to any text, but Scripture most importantly. The other thing that I think I can say confidently about the production of art is that it requires a certain dexterity. Can't take that egg tempera paint and just slap it on and hope it works out, right? It dries immediately, you're gonna have problems. Okay, so how does that fit into this high goal of classical education? Well, what is dexterity? Dexterity is a careful control of the hands. Okay, but what is controlling the hands? Your mind is, your soul is. And so this is a discipline of the body to make it do what the mind says, to make it obey the soul, to subordinate the flesh to the spirit. And I think a lot of the physical training that we do is like this. Art does it on a fine scale, whereas something like weightlifting might do it on a coarse. And so I think this idea, this sort of trope that we have of the sort of whimsical and free-spirited artist is ridiculous. Art requires discipline. It requires discipline of the body. It requires discipline of the affections. This has obvious applications to the life of the Christian, to the life of piety, to discipline our bodies and our affections. Of course, with respect to that, we have to kind of go both ways. The other studies that we engage in, the study of philosophy, theology, these things have to also influence the art. Right? How do we shape these affections? Can't just be by whatever I find interesting or whatever I find appealing. Those affections actually have to be shaped by what we know to be true so that our art can be shaped by right theology. Finally, looking at art, right? How do we contemplate the art that we have seen? And I think this divides neatly into a couple of parts. And the first goes back to what I said earlier about what the effect of the art is on the viewer, what we surround ourselves with. This has to do with shaping our affections in a way that isn't rational. The things that we have a taste for, the things that we are accustomed to, turn out to be the things we customarily do. And so if you're accustomed to seeing neon glittery letters or drab prison-like hallways in your school, then you might think that beautiful and difficult art is pretentious or too hard, or I just never understood that. It's not for me, it's not what I like. If instead we surround ourselves with art that is beautiful and difficult and deep, well, then maybe we might learn to appreciate such things, and we might learn to take a second look. We might learn to pay attention to the depth of a work of art. We might learn to think those things are worthwhile and worth contemplating. And that gets us to the second part of observation, which is that contemplation. That requires work and training. Some of it is natural. Anybody can look at a great work of art and at least recognize its beauty, recognize its goodness. Sort of in the same way that until about 10 minutes ago, everybody looked at Shakespeare and said, clearly, this is a master. This is good. Even if, well, I don't really get it, right? So there's that sort of top level of observation that all great art should do. Everyone should be able to see it. Everyone with well-formed tastes should be able to see it and recognize it as being good. But below that, there's a lot more. And we heard a lot about that yesterday, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But there's a great deal going on in art, and you need to know a lot of different things, as you heard yesterday, about how to figure out what the artist is trying to do from his work. Some of it might require some research. Now, that research might come over a long period of time of looking at other art. It might be historical. It might be having sort of a knowledge of art in your head. But there are also particular details, right? The symbols, right, that Ed Riojas' book is all about will help you to understand more deeply what's going on in the art. I don't know that I would have noticed what was wrong with that Christmas card, right? Putting Joseph into the Holy Trinity, and I didn't even notice, right? So that's because I don't know the symbols well enough. So learning those things, learning those details will help you to dig deeper into what the art is, what it is saying, what it is telling you. So that, again, that's very much like the habit of attention we talked about earlier, that this wanting to know the history, right, and the details and the symbols being used, that goes into a lot of different things. That goes into the great works of the Western world. That goes into being able to read books well. That goes into being able to understand Scripture. Being able to draw out the symbols of the Old Testament that are being repeated over and over again, like the bronze serpent, both in the Old and New Testament. Right? All those things are very much like what you have to do to really understand a work of art. And so these habits, these formations that come from learning to make art, to see art, and also just from the art itself, these things are very much fitting, very important to the formation of the student in a classical education. I'm not sure I'd quite say they are central, but certainly they touch on the central things. They help our students to learn what is fitting, what is beautiful, what is true, to love those things, not just to know them, to grow in understanding and wisdom, and to become eloquent and pious. Thank you.
I was just thinking as you were talking about learning to consume, to what extent can we think about it like learning a different language? It's a way to communicate. Could you comment, does that relate to learning something like Latin? Is there enough distinctions that it's not worth going too far with that comparison? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't compare it to Latin.
Sure.
If I was going, no, but I think you have a point. I think it's worth comparing more to oratory.
Okay.
Right? That it is a communication, but it's sort of like a dressed up communication. It's not dressed up to deceive, it's dressed up to persuade toward what is right and just and good and beautiful.
I was thinking with that even within art, like so much modern art, a lot of us, we have no clue what to do with it. So is that even a different language, like within visual art kind of thing? That's kind of a thought that comes to mind.
Certainly is. I am not enough of a philosopher of modern art to give you how they would defend that. I think that, like I said, if a piece of art is not approachable by somebody who hasn't done research at all in any way, that it has at least missed one of the marks, right? So, yeah, there's certainly a language that they're trying to use to communicate something. I'm not sure that it would be done beautifully. It might be done subversively. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, learning other languages besides Latin and Greek and Hebrew, I would actually say that English kind of needs to be on that list now for the same reason that German was 200 years ago, and French before that. So, English is the language of most things that are said, right? Theology, philosophy, now. So you do need to know that. Fortunately for us, we have at least a head start. We might need to learn it a little better, but we have a head start on that. The other languages, it depends. Certainly there's some value, but the arts are long and your life is short. And so, Swahili, maybe. I mean, it kind of depends what your vocation is. Yeah.
I wonder, I like that you brought up beautiful sorrow, and to sort of go along with some of what Riojas was talking about, the kind of function of the art piece matters. So some things could be beautiful and true, but not appropriate for worship, say, or for church, right? But then, so would we say, or do you think that the experience of beauty could be different based upon the truth that's being conveyed? Do you think those Otto Dix, were you here the first day, when scared?
No.
Okay, so do you know what we're talking? Did you have you seen them? Okay, so I was going to ask you, thought they were beautiful, but I guess that won't work. Well, I guess to go back to your, how do you give us your definition of beauty, other than just saying it's objective?
I knew somebody was going to do that. It is. I do think that it belongs with the other transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty. I think they belong together in a certain way. It is the hardest of the three to define. I think that it has. I don't know that I can give you a definition, but I think it has to have something to do with fittingness, with appropriateness, but also with magnificence or going beyond, right? So every flower might be a fitting flower, right? Every daisy might be sort of adequately daisy shaped, right? But there's going to be one, and we might all call those all sort of like somewhat beautiful. But then if there's the one that's just perfect, it hits every note, right? Sort of magnificently a daisy, right? I think that's what beauty is. And that can apply to, again, both pretty things and things that are very ugly, right? It is fitting for sacrifice to be bloody, right? And so it's not always going to be pretty, but I think it has to have those two things at least. Yeah. It also has to comport with the other two. It has to be good and true. It can't be false or wicked. A wicked thing cannot be beautiful. We might be deceived into thinking it is beautiful, but it is not.
Did you think that the mass transport thing, the magic real? Did you think that? Would you call that beautiful?
The truth was beautifully expressed, right?
Right.
So the beauty is in the technique, and that's the distinction I was trying to draw between the truth beautifully expressed, beautifully done, beautifully shown. Yeah. But then there is some visual art that its primary purpose is to show beauty, not to show necessarily a truth, right? And so in that case, then what the beautiful is going to be more important for that one, right? You can show something accurately, but whether or not it's beautiful, yeah. Yeah.
You talked about the principles, but could you talk about the incarnation of how Redeemer School does those three things?
Sure.
Teaching, incarnating into artifacts, and then studying?
Yeah, so how do we actually do with regard to art? I should make my art teacher come up here and tell you. So we do this in a number of ways. With the learning to do the technique, that is fairly straightforward, right? We teach them to do a variety of artistic techniques that will help them to be able to take what they have seen, right, and put it onto a page with some accuracy and beauty and good technique. Again, that is the part where I know the least details, and she's good at that, and I'm not. With regard to the artifacts, the things that we have, right, those we do not rely primarily on the students to produce. We rely on masterworks that we put up around the school in one respect, right? So there's quality art surrounding the students all the time, but also with our art classes, they study masterworks and learn some history of the art and learn how to understand what's going on in the art, right? What the artist is doing with these various techniques and things that are in there. Yeah, and then that also gets to the observation, right? Training them to learn how to observe the art, what they should be saying. And then they also critique each other's art, which is another way to learn to observe what's going on with the art and how to understand it as you look at it. Good.
And how to speak about it. So with the language, right, that we're talking about, there are fundamental things that make art art, and you need to actually teach the children those words. What is line? What is value? What is contrast? What is composition? What makes a good composition? Like there's things that we can talk about that they need to be taught in order to be able to observe and speak about it intelligently and appreciate it fully. So that's we start that when they're little. The youngest kids that we have, they start learning how to talk about art. And I ask them questions to pull out some of their observations. And every age, every class begins each class, like you said, with a picture study, some kind of art from a master artist and a discussion about that. That takes up, I mean, I'm okay with that taking a quarter to a third of the art class because I think it's fundamental to what we're trying to do here. So there's always that. And then when you spoke to dexterity, the youngest kids do not they don't produce beautiful art, right? So we just have to accept, like, this is not the primary purpose of that age group. How do you hold your pencil? How do you use a pencil to shade? How do you feel the pressure changing of your pencil on the paper? How do you appropriately set up your workspace to paint? You have to have your paper in one spot and your water, napkin, and paint in another spot. And those three things should be together so that we're not dripping paint across the paper to get to the water. And
It's never happened before.
and I think acknowledging what are their abilities and where they are at their ages and their current development, and this is who it's all fitting. This is how God created little kids to be. They need to be taught certain skills, like don't get frustrated with it, be patient. This is, with the little ones, I think of that as a huge piece of their art education is the dexterity, is the observation. It's not really the end piece of artwork that they come home with. And sometimes they're incredible for their age, and sometimes it's like, okay, we learned a lot about how to hold a pencil through this exercise, and that's okay. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Critique has come up in a couple different spots. Thinking about literature, thinking about language, thinking about the fine arts. When it comes to critique, this is a question for like the way the school is operated. How much do you delve into the difference between polemics and irenics when it comes to engaging in critique?
With regard to art specifically?
Well, art for sure, but you could jump off from there.
I don't
I don't think we do. I don't think we do very much polemical art critique. We're not. Yeah, we're not showing them bad stuff and teaching them to attack it.
Well, I guess like polemics and irenics, like irenics is suing for peace, like in the way in which you're
Right. And so that's what I mean is when they critique each other's art, the point is to help the other student, right? To improve his own craft. Right? It's not to say, wow, you did a terrible job. You should probably throw that in the trash, right? So I don't think we really do any polemical critique with art. Certainly, they are trained in that in the rest of the school by example. We haven't got to any formal training in polemics, although we did. No, we did. We did with some of our pro-gymnasmata. We've taught some attacks of common topics and individuals and that kind of thing. So what sorts of ways there are to rightly attack something. Yeah. So in our rhetoric classes, we get to some of that. Yeah.
I keep going back to your opening remarks and the remarks yesterday about Keats and the relation between beauty
Yeah.
and truth. And I wonder if, I'm giving you the opportunity to delve into that a little bit more, because the way I'm thinking of it is trying to relate them. And there's certainly a close relation. I think it has to do with the fact that beauty is divine. It's God is beautiful. Psalm 27, for example. And language is also divine because God spoke. God is the speaker. So, like you were talking about how to define a word in another language, the definition is in a way infinite. You can never stop defining and redefining and further defining, because there's a sense that in which that's infinite. And the same thing can be said in a way of beauty. And I wonder if I'm barking up the wrong tree, or what you might.
No, I think that's good. I mean, God is obviously also truth, right? And so those things are clearly related there. I think there's a way that certainly at a mundane level, they can be distinguished. So I think both truth and beauty have sort of higher and lower forms. It can be true that rocks are hard, right? But that's not really the truth, right? Every daisy is in its own way beautiful, but that's sort of a mundane beauty. And I think at that level, it's a little easier to distinguish them. I think the higher you go, the closer you come to God with them, the closer they come together. There's also, like I said earlier, the fact that they can't be separated, right? They have to coexist. A false thing cannot be beautiful, and an ugly thing cannot be true. That has to do with the nature of evil, I think, which brings in goodness as well. Yeah, that's deep waters. I don't know how much time we have to swim in those. Yeah.
I'm an artist, so I'm not sure I 100% understand irenics, but I'm going to take a stab at it. You didn't chase all of us away. I would argue that the autodix is beautiful, and it was distorted human figures that Dr. Snare was showing us that were depicting biblical scenes. They were drawn in the early 20th century, and it showed distress in a very compelling way. One of the words that was used in the early 20th century was plasticity, which doesn't mean plastic like artificial, but it means expansiveness or full of breath, like the forms expand, contract, and that can be connected to divine breath, inspiration.
Okay.
It's a way of judging something that is realistic, that it's non-objective. You could say, is this brittle, or does it seem to have the breath of life in it? It takes some training, it's some time. But Hans Hofmann is one person who brought it over from Europe, and Karl Knaths. So Lucas Cranach, who we celebrate, and the Lutheran, who we have, that we honor, especially has that plasticity. His figures are very awkward on their own, but express the scriptural story in a way that is plastic. And Jackson Pollock is, probably more so than Kehinde Wiley, who works directly from a photograph. So it's just a standard of it's a term, plasticity. Sure. Come with that.
Yeah. I think that's all really good. I'll come back to that in just a second, but I want to come back to this because I just realized it's related. I think there are things that can be more and less true and more and less beautiful. It's not like an on-off switch, right? And so there can be beauty in a thing that we might say, but there's also, right, it's sort of balanced with ugliness. Yeah. And so I just was thinking of that as you said that we can see some truth in a thing even without saying that I think this is sort of the pinnacle. Does that make sense? I also, when I say that beauty, that the beautiful should be expressed truly, what I mean by truly there is not photographically. And so I don't think that things have to be photorealistic in order to be well expressed, well shown. Right? Like I said with the house, it was not a photorealistic depiction of that house. If you were going for that, you would have done it wrong. And so I think by seeing what was actually there and drawing it out, the real truth was shown, right? The real beauty of the thing was shown. And so I did not see these, unfortunately. Sorry, I missed the first day. I was teaching. But I have some sympathy for things that are not exactly realistic, right? That these things are distorted in a way. I think it can certainly be overdone, but so can everything, right? So, sorry, I can't comment more accurately on those, but thank you for that explanation. Yeah.
I was wondering, I know as a headmaster, you're dealing not just with the children, but with the families and the parents involved. And the parents, didn't have access to this beautiful education, when they were growing up. So what is the entry point for someone midlife? And how do you support your children?
Yeah. It is a great question. A lot of us didn't. A lot of people involved with classical education didn't. I didn't until I went to college. And so the entry point is, there are a lot of them. I think the probably easiest one is literature. And that's the one I recommend to most people. If you can find teachers, then you can jump in just about anywhere. You have to find good teachers. And that's hard to do. If you wanted to jump into art, right, and you had never done any like me, my 4 art classes in elementary school don't count. And so, right, I would actually need a teacher. I could fiddle around and maybe get a little better, but it would be largely a waste of time, I think. Maybe not. In any case, I think some things require more teacher than others. I think some things are more approachable than others. Certainly going and looking at art, right? Go to museums, see the art, see the great stuff. Go to museums where they have, right, old masters. Those ones are easier to see. There may be beauty in this plasticity, but for the untrained eye and the one who hasn't understood what's trying to be expressed there, you're going to look at it and say, that looks weird. Maybe you'll like it. I don't know. But I think the older masters are more easily approached at a surface level. And again, then you can start digging down. With classical education generally, or with what we're trying to do here generally, start with the scriptures, read those all the time, and then start reading other good literature. There are a lot of resources available, actually now, way more than there have been in the past, to help you with those things. So, yeah, if anybody wants to do that and wants specifics, I think I have to wrap up here in just a couple of minutes to get the panel on the stage.
Yes.
You've talked a lot about using masterpieces, especially in teaching.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, sometime over the centuries, we collectively, as a society, has decided that, like, the Mona Lisa is a masterpiece, or
Right.
Starry Night, or as far as literature, like the Iliad or Shakespeare. So, how do we go about deciding when something, I guess, more modern is going to be more of a masterpiece? Like, for example, maybe like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That's fairly modern. Literature. So how do we decide once it becomes like a classic or something worth like teaching or a masterpiece, I guess?
There's two questions. One is, how is it decided? And I'm using the passive voice deliberately there. And then, how would I or would I not decide to use it here? Yeah. My answer to the latter is I don't. Because primarily we don't use things that have been created in my lifetime or the lifetime of the generation before me, partly because that's an easy cutoff, and partly because it does make sure that we're not just judging on our own standards. We do occasionally. That's not a hard rule, but that is a general rule that we try to stay in the past a little bit, simply because those things have been judged not only by our generation, but by previous ones to have been good. How does a society judge such things? That's a big question. We're not doing a great job right now, so I'm hoping that changes a bit. But
it has to do with the Lutheran aspect of it. So you've addressed the classical way of maybe teaching art, growing students in the education of art. What would make that also the Lutheran perspective? In other words, looking at a piece of art with a Lutheran doctrinal view. So with regard to something like being simultaneously saint and sinner, right? Look, how would you?
So this is a question I get often about, right? This is the classical aspect of the school. What's the Lutheran aspect, this sort of thing. The Lutheran doctrine turns out to be true and good and beautiful. And so it's the same argument.
But do you try in any way to bring out certain Lutheran
distinctive doctrines
distinctives in teaching?
If that's in the art, sure. But we're not going to try to push it into the art, right? Where's law and gospel in the Mona Lisa?
It's the smile.
Right? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I did not say that into ours.
All right. Well, thank you.